Welcome to the first part of what will be a very long lecture on elections and campaigns. So we've chunked this lecture. We're just going to need, for the first part of your homework, you're just going to need to watch it through about 7 different slides. So let's get started. So the first thing we want to look at with elections and campaigns is certainly how the American election is set up. And in America, there's 2 different hurdles that a candidate needs to jump over. First, they need to get nominated. And by getting nominated, we mean they have to get the endorsement of a party in order to get their name on a ballot. And then certainly the second task they have to do is get themselves elected in the general election. So this is not something that you see in Europe. In America, it is a very individual effort. So we've already talked in class about how the parties choose the candidates. In America, it's more about the individuals seek out the party's nomination, and of course, it's the voters that have the say. So the party system in America tends to stress the label more than the organization. So the party's not going to do the work for you. It's up to the individual candidate. Once you have the nomination, sure, then the party will back you, and they'll use their whatever organization they have for your benefit. But for the most part, it is up to the individual candidate to get that. And of course, we know that parties in the past, throughout the 19th century in America, used to play a major role, but that all changed in the early 20th century with the introduction of the primary election. So you probably are aware of what primaries are, but a primary is the election that is held before the general election. So this is the competition to get on the Republican or the Democratic ticket, to become the Republican nominee or the Democratic nominee. They come out of the progressive era. Now, the progressives were responding to perceived political corruption from guys like Boss Tweed and his political machine of Tammany Hall, where a party boss was more powerful than any single elected official or even any group of elected officials. So the party boss was the kingmaker rather than the voters. So because of this, and the progressives are actually motivated by a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. They think that immigrants are potentially threatening the white Anglo-Saxon middle-class Protestant way. So there's a crackdown on party bosses who oftentimes are obviously in power because of Irish or Italian immigrants. And the progressives promote primary elections to choose a candidate for their particular party. So it definitely decentralizes power and takes it away from the party boss. Typically, congressional or local elections hold their primaries in September. So that's only about 60 days before the general election. Not that much time to kind of reshape your message and run again. And certainly primary elections, if they're contested, can be very, very costly. And it could come back to bite the candidate in the general election. And we'll talk more about that shortly. And when we talk about the presidential primaries, we've just ended that process. So the official primary season ends with the Democratic or the Republican national conventions, which we had this summer. Prior to then, and for really ever since 2011, you have seen different states hold different primaries so that the voters of that state will be given their delegates to a particular candidate in pursuit of either the Republican or Democratic nomination. Now, the 2 states that are always mentioned are Iowa and New Hampshire. These are always the first 2 states. And Iowa actually doesn't have a primary. Iowa has something called a caucus, which we'll talk about later. New Hampshire has a primary election. But because they are first, this is the first time that voters get to have a say as to who's going to be the Republican or the Democratic nominee. A lot of people pay attention, and the media tends to follow these elections closely and raise a lot of hoopla over them. Now, the primary elections are problematic for presidential candidates, and we'll watch an episode of The West Wing in class to highlight this. What a primary election does is it forces a candidate to run to the extremes of their party, not to the center. So because the voters who take part in a primary election, these are voters who are incredibly motivated. They're incredibly partisan. They took the time to register as a Democrat or Republican. They took the time to research these candidates, to pay close attention so that they can vote not just once in the general election, but twice. So these are people who want to hear a certain message. And so Mitt Romney, certainly you saw, and after the first debate, the Obama administration said we met a completely new Mitt Romney. That's because during the primary season, Mitt Romney was, targeting his message towards a very, very conservative element of the Republican Party. The problem is that the voters in these primaries and in the caucuses are not representative of the electorate as a whole. So a challenge that each candidate faces is that they must say very conservative or very liberal things in the primary elections. But then months later, when they run for the general election, they must reach out to middle America. They have to walk back a lot of what they said, which opens them up to the charge of flip-flopping. Another point, if we look at some of the first primary states, Iowa, New Hampshire, many, many, many candidates win these states, but never go on to be their party's nominee. Mike Huckabee, Pat Buchanan, a lot of different people who you've never, or another one, Rick Santorum won Iowa. All these people have ceased, they did not become their party's nominee. So these states, even though they're first, really have very little bearing on who becomes the nominee. It is a very risky endeavor for the candidates. So if we look at a couple historical examples, in 1964, Barry Goldwater catered to the very far right, kind of promoting a libertarian message, and in the general election, he didn't move towards the middle. Same thing with George McGovern. He was very liberal during the primary season, and he remained liberal during the general election. They both lost very, very badly, which goes to show you the difficulty of needing to cater your message so that you leave yourself some wiggle room as a candidate. So let's delve into kind of what you would have to do if you wanted to run for president, because I'm sure you all do once you turn 35, have 14 years of citizenship under your belt, and I assume you are all natural-born citizens, which are the constitutional requirements for running for president. Step one, you need to establish name recognition. So typically, a president is going to have some kind of experience as a governor, a senator, a cabinet member, or a vice president. Very rarely does a presidential candidate, emerge from the House of Representatives. They would certainly have to work their way up. Representatives are obviously just one of 435 people. They don't get the name recognition. Paul Ryan certainly he was named vice president on Mitt Romney's ticket, but he was not seeking the presidential nomination. It would have been too much of a jump for him to go from Congress to the presidency. He didn't have the name recognition. So what this does, this gives you national exposure. It also gives you experience, which, voters are going to want to see. Another thing you could do, you need to travel the country and give speeches. So prior to either the Republican or the Democratic presidential primary, you will see a lot of people begin to deliver some talks that they otherwise would not be delivering. And certainly the media picks up on this and says, hey, this sounds like a high-profile speech on foreign policy. Kind of odd that, this representative is giving that speech. I wonder what could be happening. Are they potentially putting a bid in for presidency? One very popular thing to do is write a book. So I think Paul Ryan has written a book. Mitt Romney has written a book. Certainly Barack Obama wrote 2 books, and they were very, very well read and earned him lots of money. And that's how a lot of people came to understand him and promote a lot of hoopla regarding the Obama campaign in 2008. You can also sponsor important legislation if you serve in Congress. So getting your name, like on a bill like Dodd-Frank, for instance, the financial reform bill, that's one way that you can establish your name recognition. And candidates also create what are called exploratory committees. So once you form an exploratory committee, you're pretty much hiring some people to do some polling for you, see how many, what percentage of the American electorate knows your name and their initial impressions of you. And oftentimes, these exploratory committees are a step or a sign or a signal that, yes, you will be throwing your hat into the ring. Step number 2, once you decide to commit yourself, you have to create an organization. So this is something that both Mitt Romney and Barack Obama did well before 2008 and 2012. So fundraising, it's never too soon to start. So the 2012 election, really started in 2010. Potentially it even started in 2008. People have said Mitt Romney's been running for president for 8 years. So you need to raise an insane amount of money to run for president. I think the 2008 election actually nearly topped $1 billion spent between both candidates. And certainly in this 2012 election, with all of the money being spent, both by the candidates and independently, it will certainly top that number. Insane amount of money. But without money, you can do nothing, which you need to build an organization. And you need to pay policy advisors, pollsters, accountants, lawyers, bookies, press secretaries, direct mail companies, website builders. You got to buy, the loyalties of state and local chairmen. And of course, you have to recruit volunteers. All of this requires a massive war chest. And then once you have your organization, you need to establish your positions. But as we said earlier, you have to do this very carefully. So each campaign will craft a set of white papers. So Mitt Romney's position on foreign policy, Barack Obama's stance on the economy or green energy, they have to be very careful because, again, they have to say one thing to the far left or right elements of their party, but then come general election time, they have to cater to the middle. And then the third step is to develop a strategy for your campaign. So typically, if you're an incumbent, you need to defend your record, something that we saw Barack Obama do miserably in the debate the other night. On the contrary, you saw Mitt Romney, as the challenger, go after the incumbent's record. And if you listened at all to the Republican debates during the primary season, every candidate wanted to be president, obviously, but certainly the one thing they could all agree on was that Obama was a failure. So typically you see challengers go after the incumbent. Sometimes they can get in trouble for not offering alternatives, but sometimes the American electorate doesn't care and is simply content to listen to the criticisms of the incumbent, and that can be enough to persuade them to vote for a challenger and to give them a chance. If there is an open seat, by which we mean there is no incumbent, so 2008 was an example of an open seat, you typically attack those in power. So the Democrats did that. They looked back at the last 8 years and they said, look at Bush's wars and Bush's economy and what they have done to the country. And ultimately, obviously, this was successful. They were able to pin the Republican Party to the financial crisis and swept to victory as a result. And then a couple things to consider in your campaign. Your tone. Will you be a positive or a negative candidate? Certainly Barack Obama in 2008 promised to be a very positive, transformative candidate and found that, when he got to Washington, it was very hard to deliver on that message. Negative campaigning. We see lots of negative ads. Candidates use them because they work. So no matter how much they say, I am going to run a positive campaign, they are always faced with that message, that idea that negative campaigning works, and they will stoop to it. Another thing to consider, the theme. How do I want voters to know me? So you have to, much like a corporation selling a product, a presidential campaign needs to package their candidate. They need to give a certain brand name to them. So with Kennedy, it was youth and optimism. For Jimmy Carter, after the complete disaster of Watergate, it was trust. For Ronald Reagan, after 4 years of Jimmy Carter, it was competence and restoring kind of adulthood and stable leadership to the White House. And for President George W. Bush, it was compassionate conservatism, so kind of taking a softer approach to supply-side economics. Timing. When do you jump in? This is a really important, really vital point to consider. If you jump in too early into the race, the media will have a field day digging through your dirty laundry. However, if you wait and try to avoid that vetting process, you might not have enough time to build the money or the support or get the media attention you need to mobilize voters. And then, who are you going to target in your campaign? So what specific groups or issues are you going to try to appeal to? Certainly Mitt Romney is using his business experience to try to argue that he has, obviously, the right experience to get the economy jump-started. Now, when we look at the candidates developing who they're going to target, typically two issues that come up. One are called position issues. So this is where candidates have opposing views. So in 2004, you saw certainly John Kerry saying the war in Iraq was a mistake, versus George W. Bush saying we need to, follow through on the war. It was the right decision. So on a given issue, you have two completely different sides. And then there are valence issues. So what is a valence issue then, as opposed to a position issue? In a valence issue, the question for the public is, does the candidate feel the same way as me and as, the vast majority of my peers? So case in point, drugs are a valence issue. Everyone wants to be anti-drugs. Crime is a valence issue. Who wouldn't want to be tough on crime? On the economy, who isn't in favor of a strong economy? Now you see a valence issue, I think, in 2012 with the role of government. So for the vast majority of Americans, most Americans agree we don't want a big government. We want a government that is efficient and only does what's necessary to improve our quality of life. Well, what the Romney campaign has attempted to do is to put Barack Obama on the wrong side of that valence issue. And you saw this in the debate. The Obama campaign is obviously trying to counter that by, arguing we're only in favor of smart regulation. We're only in favor of, government can do certain things, but for the, we recognize that, and we only want government to do only what is vitally necessary. So you definitely see this issue in this campaign. And finally, to just compare a presidential election versus a congressional election, what we notice is that every 4 years, turnout is higher because of a presidential election. So during the midterm elections, you typically see a large drop-off in the number of voters who come out to the polls. And an example would be, 2008 was a presidential election, 2010 would be a midterm election. Now, what the dilemma, though, is that in these off years, when only members of the House of Representatives and some senators are up for election, you have to cater to a voter that is more active and probably, as a result, more partisan. So certainly more to the left or to the right of their given party. And presidential elections tend to be more competitive than a congressional election. So in a typical presidential election, the winner gets less than 55%. However, in Congress, the winner oftentimes will get over 60%, especially if they are an incumbent, which means they obviously are already in office. So it definitely goes to show you that presidents need to navigate more so to the middle of the road. But congressional candidates can tend, given the fact that they have run in midterm elections oftentimes, they can tend to cater not just to the middle of the road, but more so to a partisan element within their party. Now, congressional elections, and you see this in our 27th district, tend to be influenced by individual personality. Representatives have a track record of serving their constituents, and we'll talk about this when we talk about Congress and why it has such a high rate of incumbency. It's because people appreciate the services that their congressional representatives provide them. They can communicate with their district more easily than the president can. I mean, imagine trying to reach an audience of 300 million versus an audience of 700,000. And they can deny attachment to the mess in Washington. So they can run away from the president, they can run away from their party and say, if they had only listened to me, this would have been different. Now, what this ends up doing is help to explain the high re-election rate for incumbents. So we've talked about this when we've talked about political parties. So certainly people vote for the individual, and the individual's characteristics can help influence that election. And then finally, there is a phenomenon the political scientists notice called coattails. So the coattails would be referring to a long, like a tuxedo with very long tails on it. Now the theory is that if you have a popular president running, then a congressional candidate might get elected because of the support that that president is going to receive at the voting booth. So if hypothetically, if this was 2008 and Barack Obama was going to win an election relatively easily, then a lot more Democrats would have been elected to Congress based on his popularity. Now it also works in reverse. An unpopular president can have negative effect on congressional elections. So if you look in 2010, The Barack Obama was incredibly unpopular. This was right at the time that Obamacare was being negotiated and passed through Congress. And as a result, the Democrats took a pounding at the polls. You could not get Barack Obama to go into any congressional districts and campaign for those Democrats because the Democrats didn't want him there. Now, scholars tend to debate the existence of coattails. So with the exception of economic crises, Congress demonstrates incredible resiliency to get reelected due to the weak party system. So whether the president has an impact or not is debatable if you look at a lot of historical data from decades of elections. So we will leave you with that, and we will watch The West Wing in class tomorrow. Very much looking forward to that. Good night and good luck.